Genshin's 6.0 update introduces us to not Krai, where I think there was an expected increase in quality to the Genshin story as a whole. And after having played through both acts of the version 6.0 story quest, there were some things that I thought were really good, but also some things that I definitely wished were improved. Now, because version 6.0 is split into two acts that are pretty distinct from each other, I'm gonna go over them separately, but there are some things that are relevant in both acts, so I'll clarify if it comes up. So starting with the first act of version 6.0, you get a little introductory tour to Notcry, which to me wasn't bad, but I did feel like it dragged on in some places. The entire introduction to Notcry takes nearly an hour if you take your time, so I couldn't help but notice instances that didn't feel super necessary. Like, I get why we meet Flynn's and Dory, for example, but I just feel like you can introduce them in the story in a way that's more natural and also in a way that makes the presence feel more impactful. Like, what's wrong with Flynn's just showing up for the first time at the Wild Hunt fight near the end of the act when he's pretty irrelevant for the entirety of Act 1 anyways? Even then though, I definitely did enjoy meeting all the relevant characters in Nodcry, but some of the interactions could have been more interesting, like the Flynn's example I just mentioned. Especially because in some instances, I thought the portrayal of the key characters were actually really good. The little interactions you get through the dialogue were really good in showcasing their personalities and just what kind of character they're meant to be as a whole. Maybe this is mainly due to Yehoda, who I thought was really interesting, not just because of the whole facial expressions gimmick that she has, but because you kind of learn throughout the story that she isn't a super linear character. Like, when you first meet her, she's kind of this unreliable scaredy cat worker from the scriptorium, but as you work with her, you learn she has her own moral code and her own motivations. And overall, she's just a really goofy, down-to-earth character, in my opinion, which I think is kind of refreshing in Genshin sometimes. Actually, related to the portrayal of characters though, I thought the appearance of the twin was one of the most interesting parts of this act. I think it grabs your attention because we've been conditioned to kind of get excited at anything related to the sibling. Partially because it's so mysterious and we haven't gotten much of it. So it gives you that, oh, something's gonna happen feeling. The characterization of the fake twin brings out a sense of discomfort of whether or not you actually know what's happening. And overall, it's just pretty good at building suspense and conflict in the story for this act. Not really related to that, I was disappointed when a major plot point of this act was dedicated solely to Wilhelmina, a character from the Frostmoon Scions we don't really get a chance to interact with that much and feel attached to. And it just lessened the impact of the whole scene overall, where she's supposed to cut off her antlers in what I thought was supposed to be super emotional and disturbing, but at a certain point it just didn't feel that way. Because when you compare it to something like Capitano's sacrifice or what happened in Fontaine with Farina, it definitely feels underwhelming because you don't feel as much of an attachment to the character that it revolves around. And to me, it definitely stood out as a clear downside of what integrating the character story quest into the main story quest looked like. And yeah, speaking of, Hoyo really did not lie when they said they were going to get rid of character story quest. It was pretty clear to me that Llama's story quest was intentionally integrated into Act 1 of the main story. And I say that like it's a bad thing, but in all honesty, I was sort of impressed. Maybe because my expectations were just low, but you get to learn more about Llama throughout the main story quest in a way that's like the original character story quest, but just woven into the main plotline of the act in a way that's relevant, I guess. The issues within the Frostmoon Scions and the struggles that Llama has to deal with due to her position are relevant to the Traveler's desire for the Moon Marrow, which ends up being the source of conflict throughout the whole act in general. However, the cost of removing character story quests does mean that overall you have a lower quality experience learning about a specific character because there just isn't a dedicated space to portray them super freely anymore, and you get a slightly more bloated main story, but I guess you also get a less bloated game overall. So I'm not exactly sure if the trade-off is worth it, but I guess we'll just have to see going forward. Now, moving on to Act 2 of version 6.0, I think I can say that overall I enjoyed Act 2 decently more than Act 1 because it just felt better paced and there was more action. I also enjoyed how seemingly mundane things like fixing the cannon or learning about the Moon Marrow shield things that don't feel super important actually become very relevant later on in the story, and making these connections within Genshin's story make the story a lot more interesting in my opinion. And when they do it right, it rewards actually paying attention to the story, which I'm a huge fan of. I did have an issue with some of the more technical things in this act though, like one of them was the drink mixing minigame that they had. I'm glad the dev team is trying out different things, but the quality of it was so underwhelming that it kind of just made me bored. Another instance was there was this one time when Flynn's was telling us about his past, but it was just a couple of shots of his face with a black background. And I just thought it could have been a perfect place for some sort of pre-rendered cutscene or cinematic or whatever you want to call it. But okay, even if you don't want to put one there, the quality of that scene has just so much potential, and it ends up being so underwhelming. And okay, pre-rendered cutscenes in general are supposed to feel cool and meaningful, and they're meant to grab your attention. So I just wish they had one for Flynn's in some way. And I just can't help but think if they hadn't tried to integrate character story quests into the main story, we could have gotten something more special for Flynn's and even Llama from Act 1, because I don't think she really had one either. For some more minor comments I have about this act, I thought Revere was cool as an antagonist. His existence not being done within this one act gives some sense of direction as to what major conflicts are going to be like in Not Cry, alongside the many other things that we're going to have to worry about. I also got jump scared when Llama ulted, but I honestly thought that was a nice touch because I kind of like when actual game mechanics interact with the story in some way. But overall, when I look back on both acts, for the most part, I think I have somewhat positive things to say. Like I mentioned earlier, the characterization of all the relevant characters was pretty refreshing and detailed. I kind of like the direction that the game is going in that sense, where learning about the character happens naturally in the main story, and then you get some more of the specific interactions through, say, like anecdotes and maybe some of the events. And that does come at the cost of some of the story quality, but I think, honestly, that's fine. I think the fact that they're willing to try new things to improve the quality of the game, even if it doesn't always work out, is a good sign. And to me, I feel like the story writing has actually somewhat improved. It doesn't blow me away yet, and I mentioned things that hurt the quality of the story, like the character story quest integration. So I do think there's still a lot of work to be done, but I did find that I enjoyed the beginning of Not Cry a bit more than the beginning of Netland. So I do take that as a good sign. If I had to rate the two acts in terms of how much I personally enjoyed them, I would give Act 1 around a 6 out of 10 and Act 2 a 7 out of 10. And obviously this is not meant to be some sort of objective rating. But yeah, overall I felt pretty positive about the story this patch, and I hope people were able to enjoy it as much as I did at the very least. I think there's a lot to look forward to in the upcoming updates, so I'll see you then.